This is ThinkEnergy, the podcast that helps you better understand the fast-changing world of energy through conversations with game changers, industry leaders, and influencers. So join me, Dan Seguin, and my co-host Rebecca Schwartz as we explore both traditional and unconventional facets of the energy industry. Hey everyone, welcome back. Get ready to start your engines, folks. We've got the EV Evangelist on the program today to talk about the current state and future prospect of electric vehicles in North America. Loren McDonald, known to his followers as the EV Evangelist, has been an electric vehicle advocate since 1990.
As our guest today, Loren will discuss why governments, businesses, the auto industry, and the general public are, or should be, converting to this cleaner, more sustainable mode of transportation.
I think we can all foresee that the mass adoption of EVs is imminent and something that is going to transform the auto industry, but also many, many other sectors, including energy.
Definitely. A lot has changed in the last few years when it comes to EVs. They were once viewed as an expensive novelty item and something you would buy and use only around the city as simply a secondary vehicle. But technology and attitudes have evolved.
You're so right, Rebecca. A few years ago, there weren't a lot of models to choose from, and there still seemed to be uncertainty about their viability, but all that is changing fast. General Motors recently announced that by 2035, their entire fleet of vehicles will be entirely electric.
And they're not the only ones. Nearly all major automotive companies are committing to electric vehicles, including legacy luxury brands. Jaguar is targeting 2030 to be fully electric. Bentley plans to only have electric and hybrid models by 2026. Mercedes-Benz and Porsche also have 2030 in their strategic plans. And who knows, maybe by then I'll be able to afford one of them.
I love that you're such an optimist, Rebecca. Even more stunning is that many automakers are reporting that they are completely sold out of their existing EV stock and are now either taking orders or, due to demand, not taking orders for the next few years. So, here is today's big question. Are we finally seeing a social change that will drive electric vehicles into the mainstream? If so, what is behind the gear shift, and are we really prepared to accelerate from 0 to 60?
Joining us from San Francisco, Loren McDonald of EVadoption.com is a lifelong advocate for the environment and has been analyzing EV and charging trends for decades. He's a thought leader, speaker, and content marketer with a passion to help move the world to electric vehicles.
Welcome to the show, Loren. Let's start with you telling us a bit about EV adoption. When did you start it, and what was his goal?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be on the ThinkEnergy podcast. So the derivation of EV adoption, so I was a lifelong marketer. I won't say how many, but many, many decades as a marketing executive and marketing evangelist. And so I looked at sort of the EVs and where it was going with that kind of lens and context of it's really a marketing and behavioral economics question, right? Is of when will EVs cross the chasm into the mainstream, if you're familiar with, the book and everything around crossing the chasm. And so that's really what I saw was missing. If you look at all of the websites and everything like that were covering electric vehicles, it was all about the models and technical stuff. And most everybody was just pure EV advocates and sort of what I like to say sort of pejoratively fanboys, right? And everything was going to be up and to the right, on the chart. And I'm like, actually, especially in America, we have this thing called the middle of the country and pickups and, late adopters and stuff. So I really wanted to solve and address that question of what are all going to be the hurdles and the drivers of sort of mass adoption of EVs. And so that was really sort of the point and goal of it. And it's really taken off.
In 2018, you published your 3-part series on the 24 factors that will affect the rate of EV adoption. Of course, a lot has happened in 4 years. So how does your list of factors stack up in 2022? Has the needle moved, or are you still seeing the same issues?
Yeah, so I would say that, pretty much all of the issues are still there. It's just a matter of scale. Some of them have become sort of more or less critical or important. And let's take a look at one, Rebecca, is that if you look at range as an example, right? So, in 2011, sort of the first full year that the Nissan Leaf was available in America, the first version had 73 miles of range. We'd sort of laugh at that today. You can now get a Nissan Leaf with 225 miles of range, I think it is. And the Lucid Air, has 520 miles of range. So, and then you sort of overlay that with almost every survey of consumers done in the last, half dozen years around EVs and what it'll, take them to consider an EV or buy an EV, that typically around half or more of people say 300 miles, 300 US miles, right? This is a global audience. Always be clear on that. And we're actually, by the end of this year, we're going to average probably around 285, 290 miles of BEVs, right? So we're not quite at that 300 miles, and there's still several below it and several above it that's, skew that average. But, the first thing is fundamentally we're switching from range anxiety to charger anxiety, right? What's happening is we're getting close to that magic 300 number. And so most people now are like, yeah, I can buy an EV and drive it to grandma's or Disneyland or whatever it is. But can I charge? And how long is it going to take me to charge? And will the chargers work? And those kinds of things. So I think that's sort of the first thing. The second thing I would say that's sort of new, if you will, is I don't know that we necessarily predicted sort of the supply chain issues. Right. And not just, wiring harnesses that are critical to EVs and chips that are critical to EVs. But the latest one that's really been the hottest topic recently is battery supply chain and minerals. Is there going to be enough, lithium and sort of the different minerals that go into it? So that's one that we didn't see. And, both of you are probably familiar with a lot of those charts that showed the price parity, right? That the price of batteries and EVs and this would come down and get close in the next few years with ICE vehicles, as we like to call them, internal combustion engine. This industry loves acronyms, as you guys know. And there's been some recent studies that are showing that actually batteries costs are going up, right? And so we may not hit price parity until late this decade and stuff. So I know that was a lot, so I'll sort of stop there. But those are some of the key differences that I'm seeing.
What has been the most important or significant recent event, in your opinion, that will positively change the future for electric vehicles?
Yeah, I would say there's sort of two things that are kind of closely connected. One is the Ford F-150 Lightning. As you both probably know, and pickups are pretty popular in Canada as well. But the F-150, the regular F-150 internal combustion engine has been the top-selling vehicle, not just pickup, but the top-selling vehicle of any type in America and actually the world for 40 straight years. And so the fact that this sort of mainstream popular vehicle, a pickup truck, is actually, and it's being delivered now. The first deliveries are starting like this week of the electric version. Is I've called it the game changer, the single most important EV in history, right? And you could make arguments for a lot of different ones for different reasons, right? But I think to go mainstream, this signals to those people in the Midwest, as an example, oh, I guess this isn't just for wealthy, granola eating people in California. This is a work truck. This is actually acceptable. And the second part of it, obviously, which we'll talk a bit about more later, I'm sure, is the bidirectional charging capability is sort of an eye opener. And then the last thing I would say is just sort of gas prices, right? And so gas prices, again, which I know we'll talk about some more, is making people more aware of alternatives to the internal combustion engine. And so EVs are kind of having their moment right now because of that.
Okay, this next question is kind of fun, kind of Mad Lib style. I'm going to ask you to finish this sentence. You can't have electric vehicles without blank.
Convenient access to reliable charging.
Loren, you were recently interviewed in USA Today about range anxiety due to the lack of EV charging infrastructure. What do you think is hindering a massive North American installation of EV stations? What's the biggest hurdle?
So I actually don't agree with that assumption. There is, as you probably know, there's about $7.5 billion from the federal government that's going into building out infrastructure. There's a lot of publicly held EV charging networks. I literally talk to companies every day that are looking to get into the EV charging industry. I have never seen, one of my quotes in the USA Today articles was that it's the wild, wild west right now. This is literally the modern version of 1849, right, of the gold rush. And that there is so many companies and entrepreneurs and billions of dollars going in, because this is probably the single biggest business opportunity in the last 100 years, the combination of EVs and EV charging infrastructure. We're fundamentally changing the not only the powertrain of transportation, but how they're refueled, right? With moving from gas, liquid fuel to electric fuel, right? And so there is just an inordinate amount of energy and focus and money going to it. My concern is that we're spending it the wrong way. We're making a lot of decisions, and we'll talk about this when we talk about Canada in a little bit. But most of the money in the U.S. is going to building out the DC fast charging highway corridor networks, right? Which are needed to get consumers comfortable that they can go from Seattle to somewhere in Montana or whatever and stop along the way. And we need that obviously at some level because people like to take road trips. But the bigger challenges are, how do people charge every day, right? And there's these, and your EV drivers and owners, and this for most people, 90 to 95% of your charging is done at home overnight while you're asleep. Except for those, like in America, my estimate is it's about 40% of US households do not have convenient access to charging overnight. They live in an apartment, they live in a condo, maybe they live in Manhattan or Boston or downtown San Francisco, and so they don't have a garage. They're on-street parking, right? So, almost half of US households do not have what most of us have, which is, we come home, we pull in the garage, plug in our car, close the garage door, wake up in the morning with a full tank, if you will, right? And so if you think about getting over that, crossing that chasm and getting people over the hurdle of understanding charging and losing sort of fear around it, we have to solve those problems at the same time, right? And so if you look at the money being spent by the the federal government and the state government, not enough is going to workplace, is going to the multifamily issue, on-street parking, those kinds of things. So I think that the biggest hurdle is that we're not actually solving some of the bigger problems. We tend to be overly focused on sort of those highway corridor DC fast charging challenge.
Pardon the pun, but who do you think should be leading the charge when it comes to charging infrastructures?
That's the $7.5 billion question, I guess we might say. It's a tough one. And I don't, I'll answer it several ways. The first is consumers, right? So the consumers are sort of being left out of a lot of this discussion, right? And no offense to a lot of our elected officials, but and I'm just going to make up a number here, 99% of them don't own and drive EVs, and they show up for the photo ops, but they actually don't know what they're talking about, right? They literally don't. There was, I'm not going to pick on one, but I think it was our Secretary of Transportation or something. I forgot, or Secretary of, I forgot what a rule. At any rate, she showed up for a photo op video. And, she mentioned on mic, like, how do you plug this thing in? Right. And so that's part of the challenge is, going back to my earlier point is that, while government, federal, state, local have to play a role in this, right? Because this is this massive transportation. And so we need government involvement for investment, for driving accountability and regulations and things like that. At the same time, most governments are not known for getting things right all the time, right? And so I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of the money is being spent on sort of the easy things and not solving sort of the hard problems. So I think, it's a collective thing. We need the automakers need to step up more. I mean, one of the things that is pretty common knowledge is that, and I'm on my second Tesla. And, if you drive a Tesla, charging is seamless, right? Because they designed the car, the charging integration, the connector, they own the networks and stuff. So it's that Apple seamless closed loop. And so you don't even think about charging. If you own any other brand, it ain't exactly always the best experience, right? And so the automakers are not used to being part of the refueling process, right? Because they outsource it to the oil companies and the gas station operators and stuff. And so this idea that they need to be much more involved directly at least in the first couple of decades, right, of building out the EV charging infrastructure integrated is, they're sort of many of them are reticent to doing it, but we're seeing it, like Ford as an example is getting very involved with Electrify America, who they've partnered with, right? And so we are starting to see, once they've seen a lot of the problems, is that they are stepping up and investing more. GM has invested money, in EVgo to build out infrastructure and stuff, but it's nowhere where it needs to be. And the last thing I would say is, I'll sort of throw something out of left field here a little bit, is that none of the companies we that are in this mix, including utilities and stuff, have any experience in the refueling business. The ones that do are convenience store chains. Convenience stores, most people don't know this, but like 99% of where people refuel their gas-powered car is at convenience store chains. We used to call them gas stations, and then they started adding these little stores, and now they're convenience stores that also have gas pumps, right? They've sort of switched. So now those chains are in the business of selling coffee and cigarettes and beverages and sandwiches and hamburgers and, gourmet meals even. And they understand that low margin business. And so we're starting to see Circle K just announced today, that they're launching their national network in the US, and 7-Eleven already announced it. So I think we're going to see, and what I'm excited about is the companies that are actually consumer focused and understand how to sell refueling are going to, get much more involved in this. And I think that'll help improve the customer experience.
Curious to see if there's a wait and see game happening with customers and EV technology, in that tech is changing too quickly and they think a better model's coming and that they should wait. Is this thinking justified?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of natural behavior. You think about other technologies. I was one of those people back in March of 2010 that was down standing in line to pick up my Apple iPad, right? And so, I got it. Like I said, I immediately, before I even had one, I got what the iPad was all about. I understood it. And I talked to a lot of people that just like, I don't get it. I've got a laptop, I've got a smartphone. Why would I need this thing in the middle? And so I think kind of any new technologies like that, it's about the technology adoption curve, and it's about early adopters and the innovators. And so EVs are just the same, right? Like these early people, we're like 12 years into the modern era of EVs, right? And the early people, they're okay with only 200 miles of range. They're okay with not a great charging network and experience and things like that, right? But the mainstream, so, the way I think about Rebecca is we can't worry about those late adopters. Like we have this joke that we talk about in the industry that, like if you're on Twitter and social media, there's always these people who are like, I'm not going to get an EV until it's an electric truck that can go 500 miles without stopping, and I'm pulling a boat uphill, right? And I mean, there literally are lots of people that say that. They don't necessarily talk in that tone of voice, but we can't worry about them because they're not going to buy an EV until 2035 or 2040 or whatever anyway. What we have to worry about is like those suburban households, right? That are driving a Ford Explorer or SUV, taking their kids to soccer practice and school and stuff. Like there is literally no reason they shouldn't be driving an EV, right? And so, but they're not, right? So we have to focus on just convincing that's sort of the low-hanging fruit, the people that are of, decent incomes, living in a suburban, suburban house with a 3-car garage, have 2.3 cars. Like there is no excuse for them. So I think it's just sort of the last thing, Rebecca, is just that, if you think about like, I don't know if either of you have solar. We did solar first before we got our electric car. Right. And I've talked to a lot of neighbors. It's like, well, yeah, solar prices, they keep coming down, right? And it's sort of the same thing with EVs, right? The costs, except for how we talked about earlier with the rising costs of batteries and stuff, but EVs are definitely, the batteries are getting more efficient, so there's going to be more range. There's greater, things like bidirectional charging that are coming out, all of those things, but how long do you wait? The same with solar, right? Like we could have waited another 10 years before we got solar, but at some point you just, you have to target the people that are ready. And so the last thing I would say on this is something that, that we've done is we've leased our 2 Teslas. And here's an interesting anecdote. So our first Tesla was the Model S60 that had 210 miles of range. And 3 years later, we got a Tesla Model S 100D that has 335 miles of range. And we lowered our lease payment. And so I think one of the things, Rebecca, that we're gonna see is that a lot of people, because of this sort of technology obsolescence, this idea that every year there's going to be greater autonomous driving technology in the car. There's going to be better bidirectional charging capability. The car will be able to charge faster, more range, all that kind of stuff. So I think we're going to probably see not everyone, but some segment of the market opting to lease, because then they know every 3 years I'll just get the latest and greatest thing. So I think that could be an interesting twist in the market.
Now, what do you think customers are waiting for exactly? Does the technology already exist and they're just holding on to some myth of EV from the past?
Yeah, the latter is, I think, no. Like, I don't think most consumers aren't aware of the really cool stuff that's coming, like the bidirectional, charging, being able to do, vehicle to home and stuff like that. I mean, they're starting to hear about it with like the F-150 and stuff. So, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But I think it's really simple, and not all consumers are the same. But I think what most of them want is faster charging, right? Most consumers who don't own an EV assume that charging your EV should be sort of the same experience as, refueling a gas car. And so most people are not necessarily expecting that 5 minutes of refueling time, but most are expecting to add, 200 to 300 miles of range in, 10 to 15 minutes and stuff. So I think that from a perception perspective, because as EV drivers, and I know you know that, Dan, it's that's not necessarily what you need. But from a perception perspective, I think most consumers are waiting for that faster, super fast, high power charging.
Loren, are there more similarities or differences between Canada and their US EV adoption and their rollout? If so, what are they? Is either country getting it right?
Yeah, great question. So first, I'd say California and California, U.S. and Canada are actually from a consumer mindset and demographic, psychographic, and things like that. I think they're fairly similar, right? And the automakers, I think, tend to look at both markets from the models they design and focus on, I think, pretty similar. So I think the which translates to sort of they want the same things, like we've been talking about, more range, faster charging, and things like that. So I think that the similarities between sort of the consumers and the automakers and the kind of ecosystem is pretty similar. And when you look at sort of where we're at from adoption perspective, again, it's pretty similar. Canada was about 5% in 2021, meaning 1 out of 20 new vehicles purchased were electric, and the U.S. was just under 4.5%. So we're pretty close. But if you took California out of that, it drops down to like under 4% and stuff like that. And so we're a little bit behind on that perspective. But I think if you think about and we touched on this, Dan, a few minutes ago, is that I think, from the incentive perspective, I think that, sort of more of the point of sale rebate and something is something that Canada got right, and we haven't gotten right here at the federal level. And the other thing is, and we touched on this, is the investment, the billions of dollars we're investing in the EV charging infrastructure, and how I talked about that a lot of it is focused on those highway corridors and DC fast charging. And the Canadian investment, albeit from a dollar perspective, much smaller, is much more focused on solving real problems. So there's components of it just to build an infrastructure workplace, just to build out at apartment complexes, on retail locations. And so I think it's a much more balanced approach. So I think Canada's really got those two things right, and that we haven't gotten right here in the U.S. But the other thing that I think that both countries are probably getting wrong, or at least the U.S., is there's this focus on BEVs as solving all the world's problems. And the reality is, I've done the forecast in 2030. By my latest forecast in the U.S., 11% of the vehicles on the road will be either a BEV or a PHEV, meaning, roughly 90% of the cars on the road are still going to be, gas-powered cars. And in fact, there will be more gas-powered cars on the road in 2030 than there are today. And, if our goal is to reduce greenhouse gases 50% by 2030, we actually have to look at a much more macro approach to this. And BEVs, because I've done the math, just don't get us there. So we've got to look at everything from, I think, a bigger focus on plug-in hybrids, because they have lower consumer adoption hurdles, right? You plug in overnight, add 20, 30 miles, and then if you go on a road trip, and fill up at the gas station, which the infrastructure is already there, and you only do it a couple times a year, right? But the most of the year you're driving on electric. Regular hybrids, right? Regular hybrids can actually reduce GHGs by half, right? Because if you get the right hybrid. But the other thing that we're just not focused enough on is we have to reduce what we refer to as VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, literally by about half, in order to stand a chance to get there. So we've got to focus on mass transit. We've got to get people out of cars, walking, biking, ordering from e-commerce companies that use electric vans to deliver the products. So there's sort of less impact there and stuff. So, I think that's what probably both our governments are missing is there's too much focus on BEVs as the silver bullet. And in fact, they are going to do nothing to reduce greenhouse gases in the next 10 years. They'll slow the increase, but they won't actually reduce it.
Are we finally seeing a social change that's driving electric vehicles into the mainstream? And what do you think is the main driver for people? Is it climate change, soaring gas prices, maybe?
Yeah, it's sort of again, Rebecca, it's a mix of, depending on the sort of the psychographic of the consumer. They're sort of motivated by different things. A lot of the early adopters have been motivated by I want to save the planet. I want to do something good, just like, those of us that have gone solar, right? Although I went solar because that part of it was a side benefit. I actually wanted to reduce my utility bill, right? And so I think we're starting to see people motivated by that, this idea of, lower total cost of ownership. Although I don't think most consumers actually get out their Excel spreadsheet and do like a 10-year TCO analysis like a fleet manager would. But I think increasingly, especially with this correlation with gas prices right now, that more people are starting to go, oh, EVs aren't just faster, more fun, help save the planet, for lack of a better term. But actually, I don't have to go to gas stations, and I can actually lower my monthly fuel bill and stuff like that. So I think sort of people are starting to get motivated by that. And that's why gas prices, I think, are so critical, especially in America, because they are forcing people to think about what they spend on fuel. And then they're starting to understand, oh, you mean I pay less with my electric car? And so I think that's going to start motivating people more and more, besides all the other sort of cool factors. And then longer term, which we'll get into, is the whole bidirectional charging aspect, but we're not there yet for that to be a factor.
The trend towards beneficial electrification, getting rid of fossil fuels and replacing them with other forms of clean electricity to reduce emissions and energy costs, includes the electrification of transportation. Are local electric utility companies the right partner, perhaps?
So, like a lot of my answers today, it's going to be a yes and a no. Utilities obviously have to play a critical role in the electrification of transportation, since for most people, they are the provider of the electricity to charge your electric vehicle, unless you're, completely off the grid, but that's, a very tiny percentage of the population. So their utilities are fundamentally critical to this. And, the electrification of vehicles and electrification of everything. We're moving away from gas stoves to, electric stoves. We're moving away from gas-powered leaf blowers to electric lawnmowers and leaf blowers, et cetera. So this sort of broader electrification thing is actually the single biggest opportunity for growth for utilities in probably, again, 100 years, right? Because even though we have more devices, they've been getting more efficient, right? Every year, refrigerators, as an example, get more efficient and stuff. So even though we have more of these different, the technology devices and stuff, they're actually using less power. Our light bulbs, right? And so they are excited and on board and are key to electrification. And they're excited because it is this growth opportunity. The problem with utilities is that they are utilities. They are, in generally speaking, monopolies. And so they have, by and large, there are exceptions in certain states and markets. By and large, they don't have competition and they are not customer focused. They don't know how to market. They don't know how to build great customer experiences and educate and stuff. So they're also tend to be quasi-government like slow-moving entities, and they're risk averse, right? So they can be real challenges to this, right? And many of them, they're sort of scared, and they're scared about bidirectional charging, as an example, right? And many of them are scared about what this is going to do to their infrastructure costs, because now they're going to have to beef up, transformers and transmission and all this stuff to be able to reliably supply, an entire block that all of a sudden has, an EV in every garage type of thing, right? So they're, I don't want to be overly negative towards utilities. They're some of my clients, but there's this inertia of who they are, their DNA, that is not ideal set up to be the fuel supplier to owners of EVs, if that makes sense.
Loren, as a lifelong advocate for the environment and in the last many decades for electric vehicles, what does success look like for you? What are you ultimately hoping will be achieved with your advocacy work?
So this is easy. Smarter decisions. I think, and this is hopefully coming through so far in the conversation, but I just think there's a lot of decisions and policies being made that are flawed, and that this has become sort of what's exciting for me, and one of the biggest opportunities is just to be data driven, right? Is to provide organizations with data and hopefully accurate forecasts and stuff that help make better decisions about how to scale EVs with consumers and how to right size and get EV charging at the right level and in the right use cases and stuff. So smarter decisions is really my hope and goal.
Now, Loren, I have a follow-up question for you. What's your prediction based on the current trajectory on the future of EVs? And do you feel more hopeful now than you did, say, in 2018?
So another one of these yes and no answers. So yes, I'm hopeful, and my forecast is that. So today and I tend to focus just on the U.S. So today in the U.S., as I mentioned, in 2021, we had about a little under 4.5% EV sales share, meaning less than 5 out of 100 new vehicles purchased last year were either a BEV or a plug-in hybrid. My forecast, my sort of base level forecast, is that we'll hit about 44% in by the end of 2030. Now, a year ago, I was at about 30%, and that's how fast things are changing, right? Because a little over a year ago, as an example, Ford was considered a non-player in the EV space, and now they're considered perhaps the leader after Tesla, right? I mean, you could argue it's GM or well, actually. We could argue about that, but they've gone from sort of an also ran to arguably headed towards being one of the leaders and definitely number 2 spot after Tesla. So a lot of things like that have just like overnight changed things, and every automaker has got religion and is announcing dozens of new models in factories and stuff. So it's so a year from now I might be upping it again, but right now I'm at that 44%, which is think about it, that's approaching half of the new vehicles sold in America at the end of 2030 would be electric. But as I mentioned, the sort of the downside of that is that would get us to only 11% of cars on the road being electric, right? And if you remove PHEVs from that, it's probably around 8% or something like that. So the exciting part is that we're moving in the right direction. We're moving towards a large number and percentage of vehicles having no tailpipe emissions. On the other hand, gas cars are not going away for another 40 years, right? And so with just this, you have, almost 300 million gas-powered cars. You will have 300 million gas-powered cars on the road in a few years, right? Just look at the math, right? It takes decades to get rid of all of them, unless we did this massive cash for clunkers thing and just bought them all and crushed them all, which I don't think we're going to do.
Okay, I asked this in another podcast, but we would love to hear your thoughts on vehicle to grid and vehicle to building systems, and if you think they'll become mainstream when regulatory or government barriers are lifted.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite questions and topics. This is, to me, the game changer for electric vehicles versus ICE gas-powered cars, right? We talk about EVs being more fun to drive, faster, less maintenance, all those types of things. But the one thing that EVs can do that gas-powered cars cannot do is become what I call mobile storage, energy devices, right? Energy vehicles, if you will, right? And so this is we're years from this going mainstream, Rebecca, but the fact is, like, I have this big Tesla sitting, 20 feet from me in the garage that's got a 100 kilowatt hour battery, and we drive the car to the supermarket. It's a complete waste, right? I mean, it's just the only time we use that battery pack is when we go on a 500-mile road trip. The rest of the time, that capacity is actually inefficient. And so the opportunity to leverage that, that power wall for to use a brand name, to use a battery storage device in your car, to power your home, to send it to the grid, to reduce peak demand and help out the utility and when it's hot. And vehicle to building, which you specifically mentioned, is one of my favorite areas because it provides a real ROI to companies. So for the audience who's not aware of and understands what vehicle to building is, it's where you as a company incentivize your employees who drive electric vehicles to drive their EV to work, park in the parking lot, and then you have these bi-directional chargers in the parking lot. They plug in and they're going to charge, but let's say it's the summertime and it's really hot and it's the late afternoon, the employees agree to send extra power that they don't need. They're going to save enough to get back home, But they send power from the EV basically into the building. And so instead of that building running that very expensive air conditioning in a hot summer afternoon to cool it down to 70 degrees or whatever, they're powering the air conditioners with the power from the EVs. And we refer to that as sort of flattening the duck curve, the demand curve, right? And that can literally save that company tens of thousands of dollars a year. I was down at Lucid Motors a couple years ago and talking to their CEO and about this, and he joked that he was going to buy a lot of his employees the $100,000 Lucid Air just so that the employees could plug in, and he could save what he thought was maybe $1 million a year on their PG&E, our local California utility bill a year. I think I'm not quite sure he'd save $1 million, but you get the idea. Is that you can actually use that power to cut costs. So I think that ROI factor is sort of a real game changer. And then the second thing, from a consumer perspective, right? Like the headlines right now are about Texas again, right? Of not having enough power. I was just listening to the radio this morning, and one of the top stories is about are the utilities going to have enough power? During the hot summer, we have things like a lot of the utilities that rely on hydropower, something probably close to your hearts there. The rivers are down, right? And so there's not as much electricity being generated from hydro, right? And so you take all these sort of trends, and consumers are looking at backup power. And so, like, one of the hottest things going right now are these backup natural gas generators, right? Well, better would be, just when you need, tap into, power in your EV. If the power goes out for 2 hours or something like that, you can back up your house from the car. So I think that's, Rebecca, like the most exciting thing about EVs is that we will be rethinking them as just transportation devices, as becoming, energy storage vehicles.
Okay, now time to leave it all on the floor. What is something you want the average combustion engine car owner to know about EVs that maybe they don't already know? Loren, gloves off, go for it.
Really, I think pretty simple, that charging your electric vehicle is more like how you charge a smartphone than how you refuel your gas car. Right. And just to expand briefly on that is, get most consumers, their perception is that recharging an EV is the same as going to a centralized gas station and stuff. And it's not till you own one and experience it and drive it a lot that you realize, no, it's actually more like a smartphone where, you put it in your bedstand and plug it in, you wake up in the morning and it's recharged or whatever. And that's the same thing with your EV, assuming you have access to home charging, right? Pull into the garage, plug in, wake up, and it's charged. And the nuance to that is that, and I've got this amazing chart that I use in presentations that shows like a fuel gauge for, like most consumers, when they drive a gas car, what do? They drive the car down to empty, quart of a tank, below empty, whatever they're comfortable with. And then they pull into a gas station and fill it up to full. And this, Dan, that's not how you refuel an electric vehicle. You replenish what you use, right? So if you drive 30 miles today, you plug in and you replenish that 30. Maybe actually you even don't. Maybe you wait a couple of days, right? You drive it down and then you do it, right? It sort of depends on your comfort zone. The only time the refueling experience for an EV is analogous to a gas car is when you go on those road trips, right? And those either it's a weekend one or a long road trip, and then you do have to do that centralized thing. But otherwise, I think this is the single biggest education hurdle that we have is because it's not something you can explain to people. They actually have to like experience, to then the light bulb goes, oh, yeah, this is like my smartphone.
Okay, Loren, we always end our interviews with some rapid fire questions, and we've got some for you. Are you ready?
I am pumped, if I can use that term, and ready to go.
What are you reading right now?
I am reading a book called Hellatown by Mitchell Schwartzer, and it's all about my hometown of Oakland, California.
If you had a boat, what would you name it?
I am going to go by the Modest Mouse song title of Float On.
Who is someone that you admire?
Benjamin Franklin. I love Ben Franklin.
What is the closest thing to real magic that you've witnessed?
The birth of my first daughter.
What has been the biggest challenge to you personally since the pandemic began?
This is an easy one. Travel. I used to, when I worked in the corporate world, I traveled around the world and got to, see a lot of friends and make new ones. And although, yes, I know that was not good for the planet being on jets, but I really miss traveling the world and meeting people and seeing friends. That's been the hardest part. Yeah.
Okay, what are you watching, or rather binge watching on Netflix? And what's your favorite movie or TV show?
So I am actually not much of a TV guy. So the thing I'm binging on right now is I'm watching my Golden State Warriors in the NBA playoffs. But I'll mention one show. The one show that I did watch, and I'm not sure if that it was on Netflix or a different network. That's how little I watch those things. But I watched a series called Unbelievable. That was pretty amazing.
Lastly, Loren, what is exciting you about your industry right now?
The most fascinating thing I think right now is that when I got into this, the question was, an if question, right? It was, will EVs become the future? There was even, this idea that maybe fuel cell powered vehicles were going to be the future. And we've really hit this point here in 2022 where there are very few people that are not convinced that EVs are the future. There's still some holdouts and stuff, but most everybody has transitioned from if to now it's when. And as sort of somebody that's really focused on the data behind that and behavioral economics, I just love working with clients and companies that are trying to understand how it's going to impact them from a negative perspective, but also more excitingly, what are the opportunities for them out of it?
Loren, this is it. We've reached the end of another episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. If our listeners wanted to learn more about you and your organization, how would they connect?
They can go to evadoption.com. They can follow me on LinkedIn. I guess just search on LinkedIn for Loren McDonald and look for the really handsome guy that has EVs somewhere in his description or whatever. And I'm on Twitter at Loren McDonald and also EV Adoption Tweet.
And Loren, again, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you truly had a lot of fun. Cheers.
I did. It was a real honor. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening. And to find out more about today's guest or previous episodes, visit thinkenergypodcast.com. I hope you'll join us again next time as we spark even more conversations about the energy of tomorrow.